Someone in your camp woke up wrong this morning. Not sick, not injured, wrong. He hasn't slept. He's been walking the edge of camp in circles since before dawn, talking to things that aren't there, screaming at empty air, and you have no idea what's happening to him. Here's what makes this strange. In some ancient communities, what you're watching right now was considered the most valuable thing a person could experience. Not a breakdown, a calling. In others, the exact same behavior got you killed by your own family before sunrise. What determined which outcome? That turns out to be one of the most revealing questions in the entire human story. So what did your ancestors actually do 50,000 years ago? No doctors, no diagnosis, no word for what they were seeing. The answer is stranger than you'd expect, and more human. Mental illness has been with us for as long as we've been human, possibly longer. Think about what the numbers actually mean. In a hunter-gatherer band of 30 people moving through the savannah, statistically, at least one person was living with schizophrenia at any given time. At least 4 or 5 had experienced a severe depressive episode. This wasn't rare. This was the baseline of being human in every era, on every continent we've ever found evidence of. Chimpanzees display trauma responses after witnessing violence within the group. Elephants show PTSD-like behavior for years after losing members of their herd. But in humans, it runs deeper. Schizophrenia, 1% in every population ever studied. Amazon tribes, medieval Europeans, modern city dwellers, 1%. Bipolar disorder, 2 to 3%. Severe depression affecting someone at least once in their lifetime, closer to 15%. These numbers don't shift with civilization or the absence of it. In 2014, geneticists traced variants associated with schizophrenia to human DNA at least 100,000 years old. For 300,000 years, people went mad, and something had to happen to them. Start with the hardest answer, abandonment. A hunter-gatherer band of 20 to 50 people moves constantly through terrain where noise means death. Someone who screams through the night and draws predators, who can't carry tools or food, who burns resources without contributing, puts everyone at risk. Not cruelty, arithmetic. Anthropologist Kim Hill documented exactly this among the Ache of Paraguay in the 1980s. Individuals with severe incapacitation left behind during moves. Here's something that rarely gets said. Abandonment under resource pressure isn't uniquely human. Wolves do it. Elephants do it. Even primates do it. The fact that it happened among prehistoric humans doesn't make them cruel. It makes them animals. What happened next is what made them something else. But abandonment wasn't the only answer, and archaeological evidence suggests it wasn't even the most common one. In 1685, a skull was found in France with a hole cut deliberately through the bone. Then more skulls. Poland, Peru, Russia, Kenya, China. Eventually, thousands of them from 6 continents, spanning at least 9,000 years. Each one with a hole through the cranium, clean angles, deliberate pressure marks on the bone. This is trepanation, the oldest confirmed surgical procedure in human history. The earliest confirmed case comes from Ensisheim, France, around 7000 BCE. Stop and picture what this actually required. You're in 7000 BCE. You have a stone tool. You're about to cut through a living person's skull with no anesthetic, no antibiotics, no way to control bleeding. The earliest trepanation attempts had roughly a 50% survival rate. Over centuries, as technique improved, survival climbed to 70 or 80%. That's not desperation. That's medicine developing in real time. But what matters more than the date is what the bone shows. Many of these skulls have new bone growth around the rim of the hole. Bone doesn't regrow in days. It takes months, sometimes years. These people survived the surgery. Someone opened their skull with a stone tool and they walked away. One skull from Peru, dated to roughly 400 CE, shows 5 separate trepanation sites. The patient survived all 5 procedures. Why were they doing this? The holes cluster around the frontal and parietal regions, areas governing behavior, perception, decision-making. The working interpretation: trepanation treated head trauma, yes, but also seizures and episodes we would now classify as psychotic breaks. They were trying to release whatever had seized the person's mind: an evil spirit, a pressure, a presence with a name. Wrong about the mechanism, correct that something needed to be done. But here's what trepanation actually tells us, beyond the surgery itself. Cutting into someone's skull with a stone tool requires time, preparation, knowledge, and a person willing to hold the patient still through the entire procedure. You don't do that for someone you've already written off. That's something you do for someone you're committed to keeping alive. Which brings us to a skeleton found in 1957 in a cave in northern Iraq that might be the single most humanizing object in the entire archaeological record. Archaeologists excavating Shanidar Cave uncovered a Neanderthal skeleton. His right arm was withered, likely from birth, useless for his entire life. He was blind in one eye, severe arthritis in his joints. He couldn't hunt, couldn't fight effectively, probably needed help with basic daily tasks. He lived to 40 or 45. In Neanderthal terms, that's old age. His group kept him alive for decades. Consider what that overturns. The story we tell about prehistoric survival is survival of the fittest. Strength, speed, physical dominance. But Shanidar I was blind, one-armed, arthritic, and he outlived most of his peers. He wasn't the fittest. He was the most cared for. Which suggests that in social species, fitness was never just about what you could do physically. It was about whether anyone would choose to keep you. Apply that same logic to someone in a mental crisis. A person in an acute psychotic episode is frightening, disruptive, sometimes dangerous, but not always, and not forever. Between episodes, many people with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder function, contribute, create things. A band of 30 people who watched someone grow up, who shared years and blood with them, didn't automatically see a liability. They saw someone they knew. And then there's a third outcome, one that modern psychiatry finds both uncomfortable and impossible to dismiss. In 1967, psychiatrist Julian Silverman published a study comparing the onset of schizophrenia in clinical populations with accounts of shamanic initiation across tribal cultures worldwide. The overlap was exact enough to be uncomfortable. Both involved hearing voices, seeing entities no one else could see, feeling chosen, singled out, visited by something vast and non-human. Periods of acute terror followed by sudden, overwhelming clarity. Silverman's argument: in cultures with a framework for this experience, people who would be diagnosed and hospitalized in the West instead became spiritual leaders. The voices became messages from ancestors. The visions became prophecy. The terror became authority. Anthropologist Michael Winkelmann analyzed shamanic traditions across 47 cultures. In the vast majority, the calling began with a spontaneous mental crisis, hallucinations, disorientation, collapse, followed by recovery and reintegration with a specific social role. Here's the number that should make you pause. Across all 47 cultures Winkelmann examined, shamans, the healers, the spiritual authorities, the keepers of cultural memory, showed clinical profiles that in a Western hospital today would result in a psychiatric hold and an antipsychotic prescription. The people we would medicate out of public life, ancient communities were electing to lead. Not every person who broke became a shaman. Most didn't. But in certain communities, the experience found a container, a function. The person who heard things no one else could hear became the one who spoke to those who had died. The person who saw patterns in randomness became the reader of signs, the tracker of invisible things. Hunter-gatherer societies had no room to waste a person. But let's not romanticize this. In other communities, in other circumstances, someone in a severe psychotic state was killed, not from cruelty, from fear. Someone who attacks group members unprovoked, who screams through the night and draws predators, who stops eating and deteriorates visibly, represented a threat that some groups couldn't carry. Early accounts from 19th century ethnographers document cases on multiple continents where severely disoriented individuals were killed by their own communities, sometimes by family members who saw no other path forward. So the same experience, a psychotic break, could make you the most powerful person in your community or get you killed by your own family, depending entirely on which side of a mountain range or an ocean you were born on. Not because the experience was different, because the story your culture told about it was different. That's not a footnote. That might be one of the most important observations we have about how human societies actually work. The outcome depended on the severity of the episode, the person's status in the group before it happened, and whether anyone was willing to absorb the cost of care. No universal rule, just the group, the moment, and the person. And now I need you to sit with something that most people find genuinely unsettling. If mental illness consistently reduces survival and reproduction, natural selection had 300,000 years to remove it from the human genome. That's a brutal amount of time, long enough to reshape our anatomy, our cognition, our social behavior from the ground up. And yet, these variants didn't disappear, which means either we've fundamentally misunderstood what these genes do, or the price they exact was being offset by something we haven't been looking at. The answer, it turns out, is both. A 2012 paper in Nature Genetics found that the variants most strongly linked to schizophrenia aren't simple damage to the genome. They're bound up with traits that gave us enormous advantages. The same variants linked to schizophrenia also appear at elevated rates in people with heightened pattern recognition and acute sensitivity to social dynamics. Bipolar disorder shares genetic ground with high verbal creativity and fluid problem solving. A 2015 study in Nature Neuroscience examined 5 major psychiatric conditions: schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, ADHD, autism, depression. All 5 shared a cluster of the same genetic variants. One cluster. And here's the part that's easy to skip past but shouldn't be. You're almost certainly carrying some of these variants right now. Everyone is. They're woven into the population at the frequency they are precisely because they kept being useful enough to survive. The question was never whether you have the genes. It's where on the spectrum you happen to land. The current model. These aren't errors in the code. They're the price of the code running at all. Large social networks require heightened sensitivity to what other people are thinking and planning. Occasionally, that sensitivity tips into paranoia. Language requires finding patterns in streams of sound, distinguishing signal from noise. Occasionally, that same capacity generates voices when no one is there. Solving novel problems requires connecting ideas that don't obviously belong together. Occasionally, those connections produce a worldview that doesn't match shared reality. The people in your ancestral band who went insane paid the price for traits that their siblings, their children, their cousins carried in a calibrated form. Traits that made someone a more accurate tracker, a more persuasive speaker during conflict resolution, a more inventive toolmaker. The madness was the far end of the same spectrum everyone was standing on. The gifts distributed across everyone else. So what happened to ancient humans who went insane? Some were left behind when the arithmetic became too brutal. Some were cared for by people who chose the person over the calculation. Some were killed by communities running out of options they could understand. And some were placed at the center of the community, given a name for what they experienced, and put to work. The response was never consistent. It was human, which means it was contradictory, dependent on circumstance, and often surprising. And the genes that made all of it possible kept moving forward. Through every generation that crossed water, learned new languages, survived ice ages, and painted horses on stone walls by firelight. The mind that fractured was built on the same architecture as the mind that made fire. Same hardware, different frequency. And that's something we're still learning to sit with.